the power of relationships is in the repair. So rather than trying to prevent ever messing up, rather than trying to be perfect, rather than trying to never say anything wrong, really put your energy toward apologizing and taking responsibility for your own mess ups, even when they're super tiny. Even when your 3-year-old has driven you to the point where you're pulling your hair out and screaming and yelling, you can still say to them, Mommy or Daddy didn't do that very well. I want you to know it has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with Mommy or Daddy and how I was feeling in the moment, and I didn't do such a great job managing those feelings, and I'm sorry. You can say that to a 2-year-old. You can say that to a 3-year-old. There is power in that repair. Welcome to I Wonder, Getting Curious with Dr. Cristie Ritz-King. Ever feel lost in life's maze? Do you wonder how to heal from the past or raise awesome kids or build rock-solid relationships? Well, I'm Dr. Cristie. I'm a licensed trauma therapist and a former educator, and I am here to help you navigate these questions and more on I Wonder. Maybe you're dealing with past trauma. Maybe you're navigating a divorce or considering a career switch, or simply parenting a sensitive child. Whatever it is, you are not alone. So join me and let's get curious together. Hey, welcome back. Today, we are going to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart as a trauma therapist and a woman who works with parents frequently in my personal life and as a mom. When parents aren't perfect. I think it's kind of a broad topic, right? I mean, we can run the gamut from completely toxic and a relationship you should never have to just regular old humans, parents who messed up along the way. One of the biggest, maybe the biggest fear I get when I'm working with parents who really of any age, I was going to say new parents, but really it doesn't matter. I've had clients come to me with teenagers and this is still a fear of theirs. And that is that as the mom or as the dad, we are going to wreck our kids. Whatever you do, how you do it, it's going to be bad. And sometimes that's because you don't feel like you have had the background to learn from. And sometimes it's just because it's very different now than it was when we were kids. And so it's kind of navigating this uncharted territory. And so we're not really sure how to do it. But the fear is always, I'm going to wreck them. Every time you yell at them, every time you do something wrong, every time you react in a way that isn't by the book, it's this like primal fear that we have of like, oh my God, we've done it now. They're going to be in therapy for this later in their life. So I'm here to tell you, probably they're going to be in therapy for some of the things you do later in life. No matter how mindful you are, no matter how gentle you are, no matter how attached you are, we're humans. And so we're going to have reactions that our kids take in a way that they might have to work out later on in life. So I want to go back to something that I read that Mitch Albom, the like 5 People I Meet in Heaven and Tuesdays with Morrie, I think is the book. I read that he said, I honestly didn't read this in the book, so maybe he didn't say it, but I read this about what he said, and I'm going to read it because I want to get it right. He talks about kids, like young people, being like pristine, clean glass. And that pristine, clean glass takes on the markings of its handlers. So if you think of like, I used to in my home have like a glass coffee tabletop, but it was separate from the base. And so we'd have to pick it up and move it. And once every couple weeks when it got cleaned, it was like beautiful and gorgeous. And then as life went on and we put cups on it and the dogs went by it and everything else, there were scratches, there were smudges. Sometimes there were scratches that we couldn't get out. It never shattered, but it definitely had sort of the gradation of markings from the fingerprint smudge to the scratch from something hard that was on it that shouldn't have been to a nick or something that we dropped something on it. So there were variations of those marks on the glass. And so if you think of childhood that same way, I love this metaphor because it's really powerful, I think, to think of kids this way. They're going to take on marks from us, from their teachers, from their coaches, from their Girl Scout and Boy Scout leaders, from whomever they interact with as young people. They are taking on those marks. Some are great and some are inconsequential enough that they could be wiped off with a cloth, and then some are permanent. The idea, I think this is what parents are afraid of, is that we don't want to shatter them. We don't want to break them beyond repair. And you're not going to do that. You are very likely going to put some smudges and some scratches and some nicks in those little people that are going to grow up to have to work it out on their own. But you're not going to shatter them. merely for the fact that you are so concerned about it. That already shows a level of mindfulness and a level of intention that keeps people from shattering the glass of their youth. So I want to back up a little bit. I'm going to get a little nerdy on you here and talk about some of what I've seen from my parents aren't perfect perspective. I just put that in air quotes for those of you listening and not watching, because I think it happens to all of us. We get to a certain age, either in our adulthood or in our parenting journey, where we start to see our own parents differently than we did when we were younger. And there's the spectrum there. Like, so I had a mom who I had on a huge pedestal because she was a widow and my father died when I was very young. She was a widow from a different age and a different time. My siblings and my mom was 43 when she had me. So she was a boomer raising Gen X, but the end of the Gen X, she was old. Let me just put it that way. Now that I'm older than her, I feel bad saying that out loud, but she was an older mother. So she was not a career woman, but she had to go back to work when my dad died and actually loved it. I learned out later in her life when she was telling me about it. She really loved working, but it was a new thing. Like, none of my friends' moms worked unless they were divorced and then they had to go back to work too. Like, it was a new phenomenon. Let's put it that way. So I always kind of had these rose-colored glasses of like, this is the toughest, strongest woman in the world. Oh, I'm so lucky she's my mom. And none of that's wrong, by the way. All those things are true. And I learned out later that I had some stuff that was a direct result of how I was treated by her. That, to me, is the end of the spectrum where I think a lot of us probably fall, because it's the human. Our parents are human, the end of the spectrum, where they do the best they can with what they have and what they know. And that isn't always the best for us. A case in point, we know now as parents, if you have a kid today, you are bombarded with information about emotional management and co-regulation. Maybe you've heard that word even, co-regulation. We're trying to teach them how to manage their emotions. I don't know about you, but no one ever taught me that. Like I said, my dad died when we were young. We locked that shit up and we didn't talk about it for 30 years. And so I am trying, as a parent, I had to learn how to emotionally regulate my own self in order to pass that on to my kids. That's not my mom's fault. She didn't know. In fact, I remember seeing like a stack of books on her bedside table once that had to do with grief and adult children of alcoholics, like revolutionary, right? My mom was admitting like, maybe there's something going on because both my parents were, wrapped in this alcoholic, substance abusive relationship. Maybe that trickled down, like she was revolutionary in that she was even addressing that in 1980 or whatever. Now we're much more aware of those smudges and scratches and fingerprints that we get from childhood, from our parents. And so we're doing it differently. So you may have gotten to a point where you realize, like I did, oh, some of my stuff, my hangups, my quirks, my stuck points, my pain points, some of it actually comes from my childhood, which until this very moment I thought was idyllic and lovely and perfect. Well, guess what? Nothing is perfect. And so your money story, your risk aversion, your sense of responsibility, all of those things might be the scratches and the smudges of your childhood. And so that's this end of the spectrum, the far end of the spectrum, where you just realize your parents are human. And you have to make peace with that. You have to go through a little bit of stages of grief of like, oh, I'm grieving the relationship I thought I had with them. And I'm now learning how to have this relationship with them, knowing what I know. That can lead to some discomfort because if you go to them for advice, or you want to work this out with them, that can be a really uncomfortable situation. I didn't really come to the conclusion about my own mom until she was already gone. And so I didn't have to have those conversations where I was like, hey, you messed this up and now I'm messed up. Obviously, I wouldn't have done it that way. But I know those can be really tricky conversations. And sometimes they're unnecessary. And sometimes you really feel like you need to work it out with them. And sometimes you have a beautiful reconciliation where the parent is able to hear it in a non-judgmental way and say whatever you need to hear. Whether it's I'm sorry or whether it's I wish I had done it differently or whether it's wish I'd learned now and I don't. That's amazing. That's amazing. But sometimes you don't get that satisfaction. And sometimes you can come at them in a way that's really threatening. And so you're just going to get defensiveness and anger. So even on the very end of the spectrum, that's kind of minimal in that it's just our parents were human. They did the best they could at the time that they could. And sometimes that wasn't the best for us. Even on that end of the spectrum, you can get some really awkward and uncomfortable family stuff. But it's almost all, reconcilable. That's not a word. You can almost always have some reconciliation and move on and have an adult relationship with your families in a different way. So that said, you may be left with, how do I navigate this thing I'm going through because I don't know who to ask about it. So that's why I'm here. So that's one end of the spectrum. You go all the way sort of to the other end of the spectrum, whereas they're toxic relationships, meaning as a child, they were not the proper attachment relationships. Maybe they had substance abuse issues. Maybe they had their own trauma that they just couldn't get out of in order to raise you in a way that was loving and consistent and caring and all of those things. Maybe they have their own mental health stuff like narcissism or whatever that they just aren't managing. And so as an adult, not only do you realize, some stuff happened to me when I was a kid that's difficult, but now as an adult, I'm having a hard time having a relationship with this person, because the other thing that can happen in that is that maybe they didn't do such a great job with you, but they've worked their stuff out. And so they're really great grandparents. That is a really tricky situation because you can feel a whole lot of mixed emotions about that. You want them to have a relationship with your kids. You're resentful that they couldn't have done that for you. So there's a lot to manage there. It can all be managed, but there's a lot to manage there. We're going to get to that. Don't worry. I never am going to leave you with what do I do now? So those are the two sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. That sort of toxic, that person was really wrapped up in their own stuff as a child, or maybe they continue to behave that way now as an adult. Or the other end is this hey, we're all human and we don't do no one's perfect. In between, there are some different behaviors that I see show up. One can look like two different things. One can look like something and might not be something. So it takes a little discernment. And that is the sort of detached parent of adults. And it can look like detached, but often what it is just an adult with really good boundaries. So again, I remember my own mom when I was pregnant with my first child. I didn't even ask, but she just made sure I knew she was not going to be the daycare provider for that child. And I thought, wow, okay. It was kind of the beginning of that phase of where more people were leaving their babies with their parents. It was not a, full time, you'd go to work and your parent would be the caregiver, which is that's going to be a whole other episode because that's tricky. But she made it really clear, that's not who I am. I'm going to be this child's grandmother. I'm not going to be this child daycare provider, which was kind of brutal, but also hey, good for her for having that boundary and knowing her own self well enough to know that she didn't want that kind of relationship. She didn't want that kind of relationship with me. She didn't want that kind of relationship with my kid. She wanted to be able to feed her all the candy she wanted, take her on the swings, do all the fun things, not be a disciplinarian, not have to do that. So that was a case of she had really good boundaries, and I had to reconcile that it wasn't a personal rejection of me. By the way, she watched my kids all the time, but just not as a permanent solution. It was if I went out at night or if I had to work late or something else, she always had them, but she had them as their grandma, and they came back sugared up and sleepless often. So I had to sort of navigate that relationship too. But again, that's a story for another day. But she sort of fell into that. I could have said, my mom is a terrible person. She won't help me in my time of need. But really what it was she knew that it wasn't going to work for her. And she had really good, clear boundaries around that. Now, that said, if I had been in a situation where I literally had zero other options, I'm certain she would have stepped in and helped me out. But that wasn't the case. I could get a babysitter. I could get a daycare, let's be honest. And she knew that. And so she was okay setting that boundary. That took some discernment on my part to figure out how we were going to navigate that. Was I going to be mad at her? Was I going to think she was rejecting me? Was I going to think she wasn't helpful? Whatever. That was kind of on me to figure out that relationship. So on this spectrum of parenting, when you have the just we're human and you have the toxic, obviously toxic, some narcissistic or substance abuse or other mental health constraints that keep them from being available to you in any way consistently, those are the two ends. And then all in there are a variety of other human behaviors that you need to take some time to discern. And that's sort of the, well, what do I do with this part? That's my goal, is to leave you with this idea that there is something that can be done, but it's going to start with you determining what you want out of the situation. So again, when people come to my office or when I'm working with them on parenting coaching and we're talking about their kids, oftentimes it leads back to their own childhood, because your childhood really affects how you parent. It is really hard to sever ties with a family member. It's really hard to cut a person out of your life, no matter how detrimental and how toxic. That parent attachment, whether adopted, whether born from a person's body, whether it's some other way your family was built, that parent attachment is very, very, very strong and difficult to just cleanly sever. So that's always a last resort, unless it's an abusive relationship that's untenable and there's nothing redeemable about it. I've seen that too. But for everybody in those in-between stages, there are ways that you can have the relationship you want, even as an adult who maybe didn't have it as a child. But that's where you come in, because you have to determine, what is it that I want? Do I want my kids to have a relationship with my parents? Do I want to have a relationship with my parents as an adult? And how do I want that relationship to look? So often I get people who say, I don't want to lose touch, or I don't want to whatever. And they set really good boundaries. And then they'll say like, well, what if I try this? I'm missing this. And I always love to ask, are you missing it because you don't have it anymore? Or are you missing it because you never did? So always coming back to like the reality of the situation and who our parents are then and now, because it might be different. I've seen lots of cases where somebody wasn't a great parent to a child because of their own stuff, because they had their own trauma, or because they had their own. I'm sure my mother losing her husband at a very young age played into how she was a mother to me. I'm sure of it. My experience as a child of a widow is not the same as my oldest sister, who was 24 when my father died, and so had, quote unquote, been raised by my mother already. Our childhoods were very different. And so thinking of who your parents were then and the resources they had to be able to parent you and who they are now, you have to discern in the here and now, what is it you want this relationship to look like? You can also spend some time thinking about what you wish the relationship used to look like, because you have to grieve it. You have to spend some time acknowledging this wasn't available to me, and that stinks. And I'm sad about that. And this is how it's affected me. And now I've acknowledged it and I can move on from it. If we just try to say, it was fine, everything was fine, they did the best they can, then ultimately it comes back to us. And that I get so many folks in my office, men especially, actually, and that's a generalization based only on my anecdotal evidence. So please don't take that to, that's not a generalization. My experience has been men very often will refuse to blame. Again, for those of you listening, I'm putting this in air quotes, blame their mother or their father or whomever. They can be realistic about who they were, but they refuse to give them any credit or responsibility for how they turned out as an adult. I think it's rather endearing, actually. It just speaks to how strong that bond is between a parent and a child, that even as an adult, you don't want to speak ill of your parents. And so I try to help them see that being realistic isn't speaking ill, because part of admitting who the person was back in your childhood is also admitting what resources they had and what history they had. Again, we're all human. We all carry those marks and smudges and scratches with us. And it's how we deal with them and how we care for ourselves that helps. So the first thing you have to do is really tune into your own needs, wants, feelings, and decide, what do I want now? What do I want from this relationship now? And then how do I get it? What are the boundaries I can set to get it? How am I going to choose to behave in order to feel what I want to feel in this relationship? Being very realistic and knowing what this person is bringing to the table. So for instance, if you have the parent who maybe wasn't so great a parent for you, but is this very doting and loving and attentive grandparent, how do you reconcile not getting what you needed but seeing that there's an opportunity for your kids to get something from them that maybe you don't want to rob them of. How do you reconcile that? And so there's some internal work that you need to do to say, okay, I want to give my kids this gift that I never had of this light and joyous person who's so giving and generous. Even if I didn't have it, I want my kids to have it. And I'm willing to take what's in front of me now, not as payback, but as the relationship that I can have. I can have this relationship with them right now. I'm not going to go to them for advice. I'm not going to ask them to help me in crisis, but I am going to sort of acknowledge that they did the best they could, and now they're able to do more. And isn't that a good thing for all of us? So can you focus on what is available to you rather than what you didn't have back then? In the case of that other end of the spectrum, that toxic end of the spectrum, I'm not going to talk too much about it because that's more of like that's a therapy thing or a really deep coaching thing. You need to sort of do the work to know how you want to proceed with that relationship. You need to be realistic about who they are. You need to be realistic about what you need. It can happen. I've seen people have relationships with highly narcissistic parents who they're just really upfront and honest about what they can and can't have as an adult. I've also seen people say, I'm not going to have a relationship with this person because they are still detrimental to me. Or, and this is a big one, they're still detrimental to my kids. And they're coming in and they're saying the same stuff and they're making the same moves that they did with me when I was little. And I don't want my kids to have that in their lives. I've also had people keep those people in their lives and just be real honest with the kids about, yeah, this is the limitations of grandpa or grandma. This is who they are. And it has it's no bearing on you. There's no reflection on you. So again, that honesty, that helping them manage their own emotions, that being realistic about who this person is and how it isn't about the kid, helping them know that because we don't inherently know that, as you can attest to from your own childhood. So there's a lot of internal work that needs to be done, starting with the acknowledgement that everybody's human and everybody messes up and nobody is going to be perfect parents for their kids. Meaning they're not going to never do anything wrong. And so how do you reconcile what was with what's right in front of you? And what do you want out of that now? If you want to flip it and talk about how do you be a better parent, the number one thing I tell people is that the power of relationships is in the repair. So rather than trying to prevent ever messing up, rather than trying to be perfect, rather than trying to never say anything wrong, really put your energy toward apologizing and taking responsibility for your own mess ups. Even when they're super tiny, even when your 3-year-old has driven you to the point where you're pulling your hair out and screaming and yelling, you can still say to them, Mommy or Daddy didn't do that very well. I want you to know it has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with Mommy or Daddy and how I was feeling in the moment. And I didn't do such a great job managing those feelings. And I'm sorry. You can say that to a 2-year-old. You can say that to a 3-year-old. There is power in that repair. And so focusing on the honesty and the responsibility that you can take so that the kid isn't taking in that responsibility. So think of yourself as, I'm going to spend my whole parenting journey trying to just leave smudges, not nicks or scratches, because that way the kid can work it out. So every time I yell at a kid, it's a smudge on their glass. Every time I go back and tell them, I'm sorry, it wasn't because of them. It wasn't because of how I feel toward them. It was just me not being able to manage my frustration in the moment. I wipe that smudge away. So they're going to grow up with some smudges, but you can do a lot to reduce them if you go back to the repair process. So you've got 2 things to think about. If you have kids, you're thinking about how do I parent them in a way that maybe is different than the way my parents did. And if you don't have kids, or if you do have kids, and you also have an interesting, troubling, confusing relationship with your parent, how are you navigating that now? So all of these are questions that only you can answer. You can work them out with a professional. Sometimes that's easier. You can work them out with your partner. I'm sure they've got their own story to bring to the table. When I work with new parents who are expecting children, they're either in the adoption process or they're pregnant or they're going to be pregnant. I have a class that I call Baby Proof Your Relationship, where a huge component of it is talking about your own childhood, because it really plays a part in how you parent. And so having these conversations with your partner about, hey, I'm noticing this is coming up for me when little Johnny does this or little Teresa does this. How do you feel about this and how do you think we should handle it? Those are great conversations to have. I'll link in the show notes some other episodes I've done about attachment and triggers and those kind of things, because I think they're helpful to listen to, especially if you're at the beginning part of this journey and you're sort of like just noticing your parents aren't the perfect pedestal people you thought they were, or you're just noticing there's parts of the relationship that aren't exactly what you expected in this time. It can help to listen to what triggers are and how attachment affects you and those kind of things. So I'll link to those in the show notes as well. But for now, just know that we're all human and we're all doing the best we can with the information and the resources we have at the time. And it really doesn't have anything to do with the children, whether it's you as the kid or whether it's your kids as the kid. What parenting is who we are and how we show up in the world. And so if your parents didn't get it all right and you were left with some nicks or some smudges or, God forbid, some shattering, it isn't about you. It was them doing the best they could in the time that they had with the resources that they had. And so how do you reconcile that as an adult? I believe you can. I know you got this. And in the meantime, I'm here to answer your questions if you have any. Thank you for joining us on I Wonder, Getting Curious with Dr. Cristie Ritz-King. Don't forget to subscribe for more episodes and leave us a review to share your thoughts. We'll see you next time. Until then, stay curious.